Avery Collins stood at the edge of the forest, clearing her fingers, tracing the weathered wood of the Evergreen Lodge sign. The morning sunlight streamed through towering pines, catching on the wide windows of the cabin she had built with her own hands. A sanctuary born from rejection, a victory wrought from wounds. Her sanctuary. The sound of tires skidding on gravel shattered the morning stillness. A silver BMW careened to a halt at the edge of her property, dust billowing around its polished exterior. Avery felt her breath catch as a familiar figure stepped out from behind the wheel. Leah, her sister. Leah's hand shook as she pressed her phone to her ear. Blonde hair catching the sunlight, designer clothes immaculate even in the wilderness. Her voice cut through the silence, thin with panic. "Dad, you need to come here now." Avery remained motionless, watching her sister's eyes widen as they locked on the cabin, then on her. Disbelief flooded Leah's face as recognition dawned. How strange, Avery thought, to see your golden child looking lost. How strange to be the one standing tall. 2 years earlier, she had sat across from her parents at their ornate dining table in Boston, watching her future collapse with 6 simple words from her father's mouth. "You're the failure, Avery. We invest in winners." That night had changed everything. She had walked away from them, leaving behind more than just an empty chair at their table. She had left behind the desperate need for their approval, the constant striving to be seen, and in that leaving, she had somehow found herself. As Leah continued her frantic call, Avery closed her eyes, letting the cool Oregon breeze wash over her. The memories came flooding back like water breaking through a dam. The Collins family home in Boston's Beacon Hill neighborhood had always felt like a museum to Avery. Perfect, untouchable, cold. The kind of place where fingerprints on glass surfaces were quickly wiped away, where voices rarely rose above a polite murmur, where achievements were displayed like artifacts. For the first 3 years of her life, Avery had been the center of her parents' world. Thomas Collins, a financial consultant with old Boston connections, and Eleanor Collins from a family with political ties stretching back generations, had planned their firstborn's future before she could even speak. Then came the miscarriages, 2 lost pregnancies that left Eleanor hollow-eyed, and Thomas even more rigid in his quest for perfection. When Leah finally arrived, she wasn't just a baby. She was a miracle. The golden child whose very existence seemed more precious than anything that had come before. Avery remembered that day clearly, standing on tiptoes beside the ornate crib, reaching out with pudgy fingers to touch her new sister's tiny hand. She remembered her mother's sharp intake of breath, the swift movement to intercept. "Careful, Avery, don't hurt her." Eleanor's voice had been sharper than necessary, cutting through the nursery's soft pink glow. Avery had pulled back her hand as if burned cheeks flushing with embarrassment and confusion. It was the first time she'd felt it, the subtle shift that would define her childhood. The first time she understood that in this house, there was a precious thing to protect, and her role was to learn how not to break it. As the years passed, the contrast between the sisters grew more pronounced. Leah blossomed like a carefully tended flower. Golden hair, rosy cheeks, an effortless smile that charmed everyone who saw it. People said she looked like Eleanor, while Avery resembled Thomas. Brown hair, olive skin, serious eyes that seemed to take in everything. "Avery's the brains of the family," Eleanor would say to friends. "But Leah is the heart." Yet Avery knew from the way her mother said it that heart really meant the one who's loved, the one who belonged. While other girls played with dolls, Avery discovered a passion for building things. She would spend hours with her father's old toolbox, learning to fasten screws and connect wires. Her room filled with creations, a small lamp made from discarded parts, model bridges constructed from popsicle sticks, sketches of impossible buildings that existed only in her mind. At school, she excelled in mathematics and science. Her teachers noted her spatial awareness, her ability to see solutions where others saw only problems. She wasn't popular, but she had a quiet confidence in her abilities that set her apart. When Avery turned 12, she entered the state science fair with a miniature suspension bridge built from wire and drinking straws that could hold the weight of a textbook. She worked on it for months, perfecting every joint, calculating load distributions, testing materials. The day of the fair arrived, And as the judges made their rounds, Avery stood tall beside her project, answering questions with precise technical language that impressed even the engineering professor on the panel. When they placed the medal around her neck, announcing her as the winner, she scanned the audience for her parents' faces. They weren't there. That weekend, Leah was competing in a city-level child beauty pageant. That evening, Avery brought her medal home, still riding the high of her achievement. She found her father in the living room reading the financial section of the newspaper. "Dad, look," she said, holding out the medal. "I won first place." Thomas glanced at it once, then turned his attention back to the stock reports. "Such a strange girl," he said flatly. "What kind of daughter plays with machines?" The words struck like metal against metal, cold and resonant. On the sofa beside him, Eleanor sat with Leah on her lap, admiring the Little Miss Sunshine trophy that caught the lamplight and sent prisms dancing across the ceiling. The metal in Avery's hand suddenly felt like a dull, worthless piece of brass. She slipped away to her room without another word, placing the medal in her desk drawer. That night she began drawing plans for a robot lamp, determined to create something that would finally make them see her, something they couldn't ignore. When she finished it 2 weeks later, a small articulated desk lamp with handmade joints that could be positioned in different poses, her father barely glanced at it. Her mother smiled that distracted smile that never reached her eyes. "That's nice, dear," Eleanor said, "but please clean up these tools before Leah comes in. She could hurt herself." At dinner that night, and many nights after, conversation revolved around Leah's schedule. Dance recitals, singing lessons, school plays where she always got the lead role. If Avery mentioned her day at school, her parents would murmur a distracted, "That's nice." Slowly, Avery learned to shrink herself, to hide her passions, even to hide her straight-A report card so she wouldn't be accused of showing off. She began to understand that in her family, love was distributed like an investment. Whoever promised the highest emotional return received the most. She didn't bring pride. She brought inconvenience. Her achievements were anomalies, not expectations. By 16, Avery had stopped trying to earn her parents' attention. Instead, she poured her energy into academics and her growing interest in sustainable architecture. She won a scholarship to MIT, and when the acceptance letter came, she placed it on the dining table where her parents couldn't miss it. At dinner, Thomas picked it up, scanned it, and nodded. "Well, at least the tuition won't cost us much." That was all. No celebration, no recognition of what she had accomplished. Later that evening, she overheard her mother on the phone with a friend. "Yes, Avery's going to MIT, engineering or something. But we're so excited about Leah's audition for the Boston Youth Symphony next week." The day Avery graduated from MIT with honors in architectural engineering was the day she decided to leave Boston behind. Denver, Colorado greeted her with crisp mountain air and the promise of a fresh start. She rented a small apartment in Capitol Hill, so sparsely furnished that every footstep echoed against the bare walls. She found work with a mid-sized architectural firm specializing in urban development. On her first day at a construction site, she stood among towering steel frames, listening to the crackling of welding torches, breathing in the scent of cement dust mixing with the cold air. For the first time in years, she felt a sense of belonging. No one called her strange here. No one told her to stop doing men's work. It was just Avery, the job, and the structure she helped create. The first 3 years in Denver passed in a blur of work and learning. She didn't just survive, she began to rise. From junior architect to project coordinator, then to technical supervisor for a new office complex downtown. She worked 12-hour days and spent weekends studying design manuals and learning new software. Every time she passed one of the buildings she had helped design, she would stop and look up, watching sunlight reflect off its glass and steel facade. A quiet pride would flicker inside her, something she never felt the need to share or have validated. This was hers. But no matter how far she went, the invisible thread tying her to her family never fully broke. Every month or so, she would call home. The conversations followed a predictable pattern. "Leah got a promotion at her media company," her mother would say before Avery could even ask how they were. Or, "Leah's dating the Henderson boy now. His family owns that hotel chain, you know." Avery would simply respond, "I'm happy for her," and fall silent. Sometimes her father would take the phone, his tone clinical and precise. "Have you saved anything yet? Or are you still wasting money on those eco projects? She would press her lips together, force a faint smile he couldn't see, and reply, I'm doing fine, Dad. He'd grunt shortly and end the call with his usual line, Try to be more realistic, Avery. Every interaction took her back to childhood, where every accomplishment came with a but, where every success was measured against an impossible standard she could never meet. Then came the news of Leah's engagement. Eleanor called, her voice bursting with an excitement Avery hadn't heard in years. You won't believe it, Blake Henderson has proposed. The wedding will be the event of the season. Blake Henderson, sole heir to the Henderson Hotel Group. Handsome, polished, the perfect match for the golden daughter. Avery congratulated her mother, though her heart sank at the thought of yet another family gathering, where she would be the afterthought. Since leaving home, she had trained herself to regulate her emotions around her family. Not too happy, not too disappointed. Everything had to remain neutral, as if her heart had learned to exist under constant pressure. That Christmas, after 3 years away, Avery returned to Boston. Outside, snow blanketed the streets, and holiday lights shimmered on every rooftop. But inside the Collins family home, warmth stopped at the threshold. Eleanor busied herself arranging the perfectly decorated table. Thomas played classical music on the vintage record player. Leah showed off her engagement ring, the diamonds catching the light of the chandelier. Avery sat at the corner of the table nursing a glass of wine, listening as they discussed wedding venues, menus, and guest lists, everything revolving around Leah's big day. Our youngest daughter has done so well, Eleanor said proudly. We couldn't be more blessed. Avery smiled politely, even as a quiet ache pulsed in her chest. Dinner passed in a haze of conversation she barely participated in. After they finished eating, Leah pulled her outside to the driveway to show off her new white Mercedes gleaming under the porch lights. A gift from Blake's parents, Leah said proudly. Italian leather seats, built-in navigation, all that technical stuff you'd probably love. Avery ran her hand over the cool surface of the car and smiled. It's beautiful. Leah grinned, her eyes sparkling in the winter night. You should find someone stable, you know. Living alone must be so lonely. Avery didn't respond. She had grown too used to the way her family used the word stable as a measurement of worth, as if her choices were merely symptoms of an inability to conform rather than deliberate decisions about the life she wanted. When they went back inside, Thomas was pouring himself another glass of wine. He looked at Avery for a moment before asking just loud enough for everyone to hear, Avery, when are you going to be as settled as your sister? The air went still. Eleanor nodded in agreement. He's right, dear. You're not getting any younger. Leah gave an awkward smile. Come on, don't pressure her. But even that gentle comment felt like a blade to the chest. The pity in it, the assumption that Avery needed defending. She wanted to say that she had a good job, that she paid for her own apartment, that she'd built a career entirely on her own terms. But she knew that any attempt to explain would only sound like excuses in their eyes. She set her glass down, met her father's gaze, and said quietly, Dad, maybe I don't need to be stable like Leah. I just need to be myself. He frowned, but said nothing. No one did. The ticking of the wall clock filled the silence, each beat cold and deliberate. After that suffocating Christmas, Avery threw herself back into work with renewed intensity. Then came March 2020, and with it, the world changed. Denver went quiet as businesses closed and people retreated indoors. The architecture firm where Avery worked began to struggle as projects were put on hold. One morning in April, the director called everyone into the conference room. Avery sat in the middle row, a cup of coffee warming her hands, heart sinking as soon as he spoke the first words. I'm sorry, but the economic situation is forcing us to downsize. The room fell silent. She'd heard the news about the recession, the companies collapsing in the wake of the pandemic, but she had believed she was safe. She had worked hard, delivered results, never once received a complaint. But when the director read the list, her name was right there in the middle, clear and non-negotiable. She walked out of the building as snow began to fall, the termination letter crumpled in her fist. The sense of failure spread through her like freezing water seeping into her bones. Everything she had worked so hard for, the proof, that she wasn't the family failure had been swept away by a single meeting. She had no parents to fall back on, no safety net, no anchor but herself. The days that followed passed like a faded film reel. She sent out resumes everywhere, but most companies had frozen hiring. Her apartment grew so quiet she could hear the faint hum of the refrigerator. Every morning she still woke early, made coffee, opened her laptop, but there were no projects to work on. So she began sketching aimlessly. Small eco-friendly home designs, something she'd always dreamed of but never had the time to explore. She drew for herself, not for money, just to keep her mind from unraveling. Then one afternoon, while sitting in a small cafe near her apartment, a cozy place called Morgan's Corner, the owner, a man in his 60s with silver hair and paint-stained hands, walked up to her table. "You're Avery Collins, right? I heard you're an architectural engineer." Avery looked up surprised. "I used to be." Jack Morgan smiled kindly. "Used to be. Well, I could use someone to help me redo this place. It's gotten a bit tired. I don't have much money, but if you can do it for around $1,000, I'd like to hire you." Avery looked around. The cafe was small, maybe 400 square feet, with exposed brick walls, chipped furniture, and dull yellow lighting. It wasn't exactly a dream project, but something stirred inside her a chance to create again. "All right," she said. "I'll do it." In the days that followed, Avery came to the cafe almost every morning. She measured the space, sketched each corner, and selected materials that were cheap but durable. She didn't have a team, just a toolkit and her old laptop. Jack always sat behind the counter watching her work with gentle interest, occasionally making her a cappuccino. "You work hard," he said once. "I like this feeling," she replied. "The feeling of creating something you can actually touch." She kept the original structure of the cafe, but changed the lighting and layout. She used reclaimed wood for the counter, hung glass pendant lamps, and repainted the walls in ash gray, adding a few small paintings by local artists. The total cost came to just over $800. When it was done, Avery stood back and looked around. It was still the same cafe, but now it breathed. It had character, purpose. Jack stood in the middle of the room, eyes glistening. "I didn't think it could look this beautiful," he said. "Thank you." A week later, he called Avery, his voice full of excitement. "Avery, have you seen this article? A local magazine just featured my cafe. They're calling it a small space miracle." Avery opened her phone and saw a photo of her standing inside the cafe, the bright brick wall behind her with the caption, "Local engineer turned a forgotten coffee corner into a masterpiece of light and warmth." She read it over and over, not because of recognition, but because for the first time someone saw her worth. Not through the name Collins, not through her parents' shadow, but through her own hands. After the renovation project went viral across the local community, her inbox began to fill daily with collaboration offers, small design requests, and even a few thank you messages from strangers who said her story had inspired them. She never imagined that a project worth only $1,000 could open an entirely new door. Gradually, Avery started taking on more renovation work, mostly small homes around Denver, whose owners wanted to optimize their living spaces. One of those projects, an old brick house on the outskirts of Golden, would change her life completely. The house belonged to a retired veteran who was moving in with his daughter. When Avery arrived for the initial inspection, the person who opened the door wasn't the homeowner, but the engineer hired to assess the foundation and structure. Ryan Walker was about 35 tall, with neatly cut dark brown hair and calm gray eyes that held both strength and warmth. His hands were covered in cement dust, his sleeves rolled up, revealing faint scars running along his forearms. "You're Collins, the architectural designer, right?" he asked, his voice low and steady. Avery nodded. "And you're the one making sure this house doesn't collapse during renovation?" He chuckled softly but sincerely. "That's right. And I suppose you'll be the one making it beautiful again." In the days that followed, they worked side by side. Avery handled the design elements while Ryan managed the structural reinforcements. He was unlike any engineer she had met before, neither arrogant nor eager to prove himself. He worked slowly with a meticulousness that bordered on meditative. Each morning he arrived at the site before anyone else brewed coffee for the small crew, and inspected every steel bar, every joint before work began. Avery found herself watching him quietly amazed by his patience and calm precision. And somehow, she could feel that he was paying the same kind of attention to her. One afternoon, as she sat on the concrete floor sketching blueprints in the middle of the construction site, Ryan handed her a bottle of water. "You always focus so hard, you forget the world exists," he said. Avery smiled. "If I don't, the design might collapse before it's even built." He looked at her for a long moment, then said softly, "No, I mean, I've never met anyone who looks at a house as if they can see its soul." She felt a flush rise to her cheeks and pretended not to hear. But that night when she got home, his words echoed in her mind, warm like the glow of a winter lamp spilling through a window. The more they worked together, the more Avery realized Ryan understood the value of silence. He didn't talk much, but when he did, every word came from a place of attention. When workers made mistakes, he never yelled. He simply corrected them, sometimes demonstrating the proper technique himself. He had once been a Marine stationed in the Middle East and had seen too many things fall apart to believe that shouting could put them back together. She once asked him why he left the military. "Because I wanted to build things instead of destroy them," he replied. It was a simple answer, but it stopped her in her tracks. She saw herself in it, her own desire to create spaces where people could feel safe, whole, and seen. One Friday evening, after submitting their final project report, Ryan invited her to dinner. They chose a small restaurant near Sloan's Lake. Early spring in Denver still carried a bite in the air, but inside the lighting was warm, and the smell of toasted bread filled the room. At first, their conversation revolved around work materials, structures, the common mistakes builders made. But gradually, it grew more personal. He told her about his time in the barracks, about long nights in the desert, where the only sounds were the wind and an old radio playing staticky music. She told him about her small studio, about that first cafe project, and the feeling of seeing her name in print for the very first time. "It sounds like you're starting to find yourself again," he said. Avery stayed quiet, swirling the wine in her glass. "Maybe," she answered softly, "but sometimes it still feels like I'm running away." He tilted his head, his gaze softening. "Running away from what?" She almost said, "From myself," but her lips pressed shut. She turned her eyes away and shifted the conversation to the historic architecture of the neighborhood. He didn't press her, only smiled as if he understood there are wounds that don't need to be pried open. But that silence didn't last forever. A few weeks later, when the Golden Project wrapped up, Ryan came by to hand her the final technical documents. It was raining that day, and Avery invited him to stay for tea. They sat by the window, listening to the rain pouring down outside. After a few minutes of quiet, he said, "I notice you always avoid talking about your family. Whenever someone mentions parents or siblings, your eyes change." Avery froze, then let out a slow sigh. "Because they're no longer part of my life." He didn't react, just nodded, waiting. So she told him, slowly, piece by piece, about a childhood spent on the sidelines, about the dinner where her father called her a failure, about the final message she sent in the middle of a snowy night. She didn't cry. She was too far beyond that pain for tears. When she finished, the room was utterly still. Ryan didn't speak for several seconds. Then he placed his hand on the table near hers, not touching, but close enough for her to feel the warmth. "You don't need their approval," he said quietly. "You've already proved yourself with the life you've built." The words were simple, but they felt like someone loosening a rope that had been tied around her chest for years. She took a deep breath, feeling lighter for the first time since she could remember. He didn't pity her. He didn't try to give advice. He simply acknowledged her worth as something self-evident. From then on, they began working together more often. Ryan started joining several of Avery's smaller projects. He had a practical vision, and she had a creative instinct, two seemingly opposite forces that somehow fit perfectly together. One evening, while they were discussing a client's request for an eco-friendly compact home, Ryan suddenly said, "Have you ever thought about creating a sustainable living model? A house that can generate its own energy, save materials, but still feel warm and beautiful?" Avery looked at him, her eyes lighting up. "You're reading my mind. I've wanted to do that since college, but never had the chance." He smiled. Then maybe now's the time. What should we call it? She paused for a moment before replying. The Evergreen Project. He nodded. Perfect. You handle the design. I'll handle the engineering and construction. Together we'll prove that small doesn't mean less. They shook hands, and in that instant, Avery realized this meeting between them was never just about work. Ryan hadn't come into her life to save her. He had simply appeared at the exact moment she was ready to rebuild herself. And for the first time in years, she didn't feel alone anymore. That summer, after months of nonstop projects around the city, Ryan suggested they take a few days off to recharge. He knocked on her studio door one afternoon, holding 2 cups of coffee and a folded map. Ever been to the Oregon coast? He asked, his tone casual, but carrying a hint of something deeper. Avery shook her head. Then we're going this weekend. Just a few days. No work, no emails, no pressure. She wasn't the kind of person who easily detached from work, but the way he said it, firm yet gentle, made her nod without hesitation. 3 days later, they drove out of Denver in Ryan's old pickup truck just as dawn was breaking. Avery sat in the passenger seat, holding a cup of coffee, watching the Rocky Mountains shrink in the rearview mirror. The farther they went, the more the air changed. The dry chill of the mountains gave way to the damp scent of pine forests, and soon the faint smell of salt began to drift through the open window. When the truck rounded the last curve and the Oregon coastline unfolded before them, Avery's heart tightened. It was breathtaking, vast, and endless. The ocean stretched deep blue beneath the sky draped in mist. The cliffs were carpeted with moss and fog. The sea breeze carried a salty sharpness tossing her hair, and for a moment she felt so small she could dissolve into the world itself. They stopped in a small coastal town called Sea Cliff. Wooden houses stood close together with slanted roofs, thin trails of smoke curling from their chimneys. Ryan rented a weathered cabin nestled near the forest, where the sound of crashing waves blended with the whisper of wind through the trees. On their first morning there, Avery woke earlier than Ryan brewed coffee and sat on the porch. The first light of day filtered through the mist, scattering silver across the surface of the sea. She felt an unfamiliar stillness settle inside her, a peace she hadn't known in years. It wasn't the silence of loneliness. It was the quiet of someone who had finally found where they belonged. That afternoon, as they drove down a narrow road skirting the forest, Ryan suddenly slowed down. "Look," he said. Avery glanced up and saw a weathered wooden sign tilted slightly by the roadside. The white paint was fading, but the words were still visible: "For sale, 5 acres." Below it, a handwritten phone number and a price, $85,000. Behind the sign, a dirt path disappeared into a lush green forest. And from somewhere beyond the trees came the muffled crash of waves against rock. "Let's check it out," Ryan said, half joking, half serious. Avery laughed. "You're thinking of buying a forest now." He grinned. "No," he said. "Just thought we should see what destiny looks like." The road leading into the property was uneven, overgrown with knee-high grass. But the moment Avery stepped out of the truck, she froze. Before her stretched an open clearing, sloping gently toward the ocean, encircled by towering Douglas firs. Sunlight filtered through the branches, scattering golden patches across the ground. In the distance, beyond the line of trees, she could see a narrow stream trickling toward the sea. The sight was so breathtaking, it felt unreal. Avery stood still as the wind swept through her hair, the scent of salt and pine resin mingling in the air. Without warning, tears welled up in her eyes. She didn't know why she was crying. Maybe because after all these years she had never felt so connected to something. Not to a person, not to a house, but to the land itself, to nature. The one place where she could truly begin again. Ryan stood beside her silent for a while, before quietly asking, "What are you thinking?" Avery wiped her tears and smiled faintly. "I think this is where I was meant to be." He looked at her and nodded. "Then let's call the owner." The man who answered was named George Winters. His voice was raspy and tired yet warm. He agreed to meet them later that afternoon. When he arrived, he stepped out of an old pickup truck, a thin, white-haired man with kind, alert eyes. "You two here to see the land?" he asked with a gentle smile. Avery nodded and explained their idea. a small sustainable cabin that could generate its own energy built from reclaimed materials, a prototype for their evergreen project. I know it sounds ambitious, she added, a little embarrassed. But George didn't laugh. He stood quietly scanning the land, then turned back to them, his expression softening. You know, he said, I've had this land for over 40 years. I once planned to build a little house here for my wife, but she passed away before I could. Since then, I've never touched it. Hearing you talk about your project today, maybe it's finally going to be used the right way. Ryan asked, Are you still selling it for $85,000, say? George smiled. If I were younger, I'd give it to you for free. But tell you what, I'll lower it to 75. Call it my faith in young people who still dare to dream. Avery froze. She only had $60,000 in her savings account money she'd spent years setting aside. Ryan glanced at her and understood immediately. I'll cover the rest, he said quietly. We'll draw up an agreement, divide the investment and ownership fairly. No strings attached, just equality. Avery looked at him for a long moment, and in his eyes she saw no pity, only pure respect. Are you sure? I'm sure, he replied. Sometimes to build something big, it takes two sets of hands. They shook hands with George that very day. He showed them the land title, explaining that there was no house, only a dry well, and a few old boundary markers. When they signed the deposit papers, his hand trembled slightly. Then he looked at Avery with an earnest gaze. People think you need money to start something, he said, but really all you need is faith, and I see that in both of you. Avery couldn't find any words, just nodded softly. By the time they left, the sun was already setting. The golden light poured over the forest, and the wind rustled the leaves like quiet whispers. Sitting in the truck holding the contract in her hands, Avery felt as if she were holding something sacred. Ryan glanced over and smiled. Welcome to your new life, landowner Collins. Avery laughed through her tears. That night she opened her notebook and wrote on the first page, Today among the pines and the sound of the sea. I bought 5 acres of land, not just with money, but with faith. For the first time in my life, I own something no one can take away from me, a piece of earth that is mine. She looked out the cabin window toward the dark outline of the forest, feeling a strange certainty. This land would not just be a place to build a home. It would be the foundation for everything she was meant to become. And on that foundation, she would build not just walls and a roof, but a life defined by her own vision, not the one her family had tried to force upon her. This would be her answer to her father's words, not with anger, not with spite, but with the quiet power of creation. The first days after buying the land were filled with misty mornings and hands sticky with pine resin. Their patch of forest near the Oregon coast had no electricity, no paved road, only the wind, the scent of salt and air so pure it silenced every thought. Avery and Ryan set up a temporary tent near the small stream that trickled toward the ocean, using it as both workspace and shelter. Each morning they made coffee with water boiled on a portable gas stove and watched the fog lift slowly as sunlight filtered through the pine branches like ribbons of gold. Amid that quiet, Avery spread her blueprints across an old wooden table they had salvaged from a nearby thrift shop. Ryan leaned beside her, pencil in hand, helping her refine what would become Evergreen Lodge. Small, simple, sustainable, Avery murmured, sketching the outline of a compact cabin. 600 square feet, just enough for what we need. The design took shape under her pencil: an open kitchen and living space, a small workspace tucked beneath a sleeping loft, and a wide porch that opened toward the forest and distant ocean. Ryan wanted the cabin to breathe with nature, while Avery insisted that every detail carry the mark of human hands, imperfect but honest. We'll use reclaimed pine from that abandoned barn in Astoria, Ryan suggested. It'll be economical and perfectly aligned with what we're trying to create. Avery nodded, a smile playing on her lips. For the first time in her life, someone was meeting her vision with excitement rather than skepticism. What began as a dream on paper soon transformed into physical reality as they marked the foundation and cleared the land. Even on rainy days when mud reached their ankles, they kept working. Ryan joked, "This is the best outdoor gym in Oregon." Avery laughed. "If I lose weight, I'm blaming the cabin." But on stormy nights, lying in the tent listening to the wind roar through the trees, she felt both smaller and stronger than ever before. There was something purifying about building with their own hands, about stripping away the excess until only the essential remained. Their idealism, however, soon met the harsh realities of construction. What had seemed straightforward on paper revealed its complications in execution. One morning, after a night of heavy rain, they arrived at the site to find the foundation trench flooded, the wooden markers washed away, and $5,000 worth of materials ruined. "This is a disaster," Avery whispered, staring at the muddy water where their careful measurements had been. Ryan assessed the damage with a calm she couldn't fathom. "It's a setback, not a failure. We'll need to regrade the land, create better drainage." They spent 3 days digging new channels to direct water away from the building site, working from sunrise until their muscles screamed for rest. When they finally cleared the area, they discovered the ground was less stable than their initial assessment had indicated. They would need to drive the foundation posts deeper. "That means more equipment, more cost," Avery said, anxiety creeping into her voice as she calculated the new expenses in her head. Then came the news that the reclaimed timber from the Astoria barn would cost 40% more than estimated to transport. The small budget they had carefully planned began to stretch beyond its limits. "Maybe we should scale back," Ryan suggested one evening, looking at the revised plans. "Make the cabin smaller." "No," Avery said firmly, surprising even herself with her conviction. "If we compromise now, we'll never stop. This is our vision. We'll find another way." She began taking remote design jobs, working late into the night on her laptop, the blue light illuminating the tent as Ryan slept beside her. Each dollar she earned went directly into the Evergreen Fund. Each sacrifice felt like an investment in freedom. The biggest challenge came when they discovered that the water line would need to be extended much farther than anticipated, requiring expensive permits from the county. $3,000 just for the paperwork, Avery said, clutching the notice from the county office. "That's almost everything we have left." For the first time since they began, tension crackled between them. The strain of limited resources, physical exhaustion, and mounting obstacles pushed them to their limits. "We should have done more research before buying the land," Ryan said, his voice sharper than usual. "We were too caught up in the romance of it all." "Are you saying this was a mistake?" Avery asked, her voice small but edged with hurt. Ryan ran his hands through his hair. "I'm saying we were naive. We underestimated almost everything." They ate dinner in silence that night, the distance between them feeling wider than the few feet that separated them physically. Later, when Avery thought Ryan was asleep, she slipped out of the tent and walked to the edge of the property where the land met the sky. The moon hung low and full, casting silver light across the clearing. In its glow, she could see the rough outline of what would become their home if they could just push through these challenges. She sat on a fallen log, hugging her knees to her chest. "Maybe my father was right," she whispered to the night. "Maybe I really am chasing impossible dreams." She didn't hear Ryan approach until he settled beside her on the log. He didn't touch her, didn't speak immediately. Together they sat watching moonlight dance on distant waves. "Your father was wrong," he said finally. "But building something meaningful is never easy. Every project has its breaking points. The question is whether we care enough to push through them." Avery turned to look at him, his profile silver in the moonlight. "Do we?" He met her gaze. "I do, if you do." Something shifted between them in that moment, a deeper understanding that what they were building was more than a cabin. It was a testament to resilience, to believing in something enough to fight for it, despite every reason to quit. The next morning, they redesigned the water system to reduce costs, found a local supplier who would sell them timber at half price if they hauled it themselves, and reached out to the county to negotiate a payment plan for the permits. One problem at a time, one solution after another. The work was harder than either had anticipated, but with each obstacle overcome, their commitment deepened. As summer faded into fall, the skeleton of the cabin began to rise against the sky. The foundation was secure, the frame standing proud. They celebrated small victories with quiet dignity, the completion of the floor, the raising of the first wall, the installation of windows that would capture both sunrise and sunset. But the physical toll was evident. Avery's hands, once smooth and clean, now bore calluses and small scars. Ryan's face had grown leaner, weathered by sun and wind. Both had lost weight, their clothes hanging loose on frames made strong by constant labor. One evening, as dusk settled over the property, Avery was drilling into the wall for an electrical conduit when the drill bit snapped. The sudden jolt sent pain shooting through her wrist. The culmination of months of stress, physical strain, and financial worry crashed down on her at once. She burst into tears, dropping to her knees on the unfinished floor. Ryan was at her side in an instant, gathering her against him without a word. He held her as she sobbed, her tears soaking through his shirt. "I can't do this anymore," she whispered. "I'm so tired." He stroked her hair gently. "You don't have to prove anything to anyone, Avery. This cabin doesn't have to be perfect. It just has to be yours." His words silenced her tears. In that moment, Avery realized that perhaps what she was building wasn't only a house, but also the part of herself her family had once denied. The right to create on her own terms, the right to define success by her own standards. "Ours," she corrected softly. "It has to be ours." Ryan smiled, the corners of his eyes crinkling. "Then let's finish it together." As word spread about their project, unexpected help arrived. Jack Morgan drove up from Denver with 3 of his cafe staff bringing food tools and an unshakable belief in what Avery and Ryan were creating. "I owe you, Avery," he said, handing her a box of handmade light fixtures. "Let me repay with sweat in these. A friend of mine makes them from recycled glass." Several of Avery's former clients came too, each bringing something useful: an extra set of hands, a specific skill, or simply encouragement when spirits flagged. Even George Winters, the previous owner of the land, stopped by occasionally, watching the progress with quiet approval. "You're doing right by this place," he told them one afternoon, his weathered face creased with a smile. "My Margaret would have loved to see it." Avery realized she was witnessing something remarkable: the formation of a community, not by blood but by choice. People drawn together by shared values and mutual respect. This was something her family had never given her yet. Here it was forming naturally around the life she had chosen to build. Ryan proved to be the soul of the build. He understood structure the way most people understand breathing, innately, thoroughly. Whenever exhaustion threatened to overwhelm Avery, he would say, "One plank at a time. It doesn't have to be perfect. It just has to move forward." She remembered one morning so cold, her hands cracked and bled as she worked with the unforgiving wood. Ryan still carried heavy timber beside her, telling old military stories just to make her laugh, to distract her from the pain and fatigue. At night, they would sit by the fire, drink cold beer, and talk about the future, about the people who would one day live in sustainable homes like theirs, about how they could expand this model to help entire communities. By the 4th month, when the roof of the cabin was finally in place, Avery began designing the interior. With no real budget, she did almost everything herself. The kitchen counter came from old pine boards salvaged from a demolished restaurant. Lamps were fashioned out of recycled glass bottles. Bookshelves were built from discarded window frames. She remembered those mornings at the town's flea market, coffee in hand, discovering pieces that seemed worthless but were strangely beautiful. She painted, sanded, and assembled, and every time a detail came together, happiness spread through her like an electric current. Ryan watched her work and laughed. "I've never seen anyone love every single nail the way you do." Avery smiled. "Every nail is an act of defiance. You wouldn't understand." But he did understand. In his own way, he too was rebuilding himself through this project, finding peace in creation after years of witnessing destruction. They worked through the fall, racing against the approaching winter. The first snow fell early that year, dusting the half-finished cabin with white. They covered the windows with tarps, installed a small wood stove, and continued working inside, their breath visible in the cold air. Sometimes the workload crushed them. Their bodies ached, their shoulders burned, their hands were raw and scratched. But there was a different kind of satisfaction in this exhaustion. It was earned, purposeful, the tired muscles evidence of a day spent building something real. One evening, as the winter wind howled outside, Avery sat cross-legged on the floor of what would become the living room. She was sketching plans for built-in storage when Ryan appeared in the doorway holding two steaming mugs of tea. "Come outside for a minute," he said. "I want to show you something." Puzzled, Avery followed him onto the porch, wrapping her coat tightly around herself against the cold. Ryan pointed up at the night sky, where stars blazed against perfect blackness, undiminished by city lights. "Look at that," he said softly. "You'd never see this in Denver." They stood side by side, watching their breath cloud in the frozen air, feeling impossibly small beneath the vast expanse of stars. Avery felt something shift inside her, a perspective adjustment. The difficulties they faced seemed smaller suddenly, less significant, when viewed against the backdrop of the universe. "Thank you," she whispered. Ryan looked at her questioningly. "For believing in this? For believing in me?" He smiled. "You made it easy." In that moment, with the cold biting at her cheeks and starlight reflecting in Ryan's eyes, Avery knew with absolute certainty that she had found her place in the world. Not in her family's approval, not in professional accolades, but here, in this imperfect cabin, with this man who saw her completely and still chose to stand beside her. The winter months passed in a blur of interior work, insulation, wiring, plumbing. They installed solar panels on the south-facing roof, a rainwater collection system, and a small wind turbine that hummed softly in the coastal breeze. Everything in the cabin was designed to work with nature rather than against it. When spring finally arrived, bringing with it longer days and warmer temperatures, the end of their journey was in sight. The final touches came together like the last pieces of a puzzle: the handcrafted door, the stone hearth, the windows that captured both forest and sea in their frames. By the 10th month after breaking ground, Evergreen Lodge was complete. They kept its name true to the spirit of the Project Evergreen, something that never fades, that stands tall through time. The small cabin stood quietly in the forest, with a slanted matte metal roof, pale wooden walls, and wide windows opening toward the endless sky. Inside, natural light filled every corner. Everything was simple, uncluttered, and warm. The open floor plan made the modest space feel generous. The kitchen flowed into the living area, which opened to the porch through sliding glass doors. The sleeping loft above was accessible by a narrow staircase built from driftwood collected from the beach. Every detail had been considered. Every element served a purpose. Ryan planted a row of saplings along the path leading to the cabin, while Avery placed a small lamp on the window ledge, made from a block of wood and a glass bulb, a reborn version of the robot lamp from her childhood, a symbol of the dreams she had refused to abandon. On the afternoon they finished, they sat on the porch watching the sun dip behind the pines. The air was cool but pleasant, carrying the mingled scents of ocean salt and forest pine. Birdsong filled the trees, and somewhere in the distance, waves crashed against the shoreline in a steady rhythm. "I can't believe we actually did it," Avery said, leaning back in her chair, exhaustion and pride mingling in her voice. Ryan smiled. "Was there ever any doubt?" She laughed. "About 1,000 times, yes." He reached over and took her hand, his calloused palm warm against hers. "But you never quit." "Neither did you." They sat in comfortable silence as twilight deepened around them. Everything they had endured, the financial strain, the physical exhaustion, the moments of doubt, had been worth it. They had created something honest and enduring, something that reflected their values and vision. Avery took a single photo of the cabin bathed in golden light, the forest behind it aglow in the setting sun. That evening, she posted it on social media with a short caption, "Built this, proud." No hashtags, no advertisements, no pretense. She only wanted to mark the moment, to keep a record of this healing. But by the next morning, the post had gone viral. Thousands of shares, hundreds of messages pouring in from all over. People wrote that her story made them believe in new beginnings. A local architecture magazine reached out asking to interview her about sustainable microhomes. A popular blogger published a feature titled "Evergreen Lodge, the tiny house built with enormous strength." And then something extraordinary happened. Avery's inbox exploded with inquiries. Young couples seeking minimalist lives, environmental groups, small families, everyone wanted an evergreen lodge of their own. Ryan brought her a newspaper, placing it on the table, pointing to the headline, Collins Design Studio, the Future of Sustainable Living. Avery stared at the words for a long time. Everything inside her went still, not because of pride, but because she knew this journey hadn't started with wealth or privilege. It had started with a wound, and that wound had become the foundation of a new life. That evening, she stepped out onto the porch. The air carried the scent of pine and the distant crash of waves. She whispered to herself, I didn't need anyone's $150,000. She had turned her wounds into her foundation. And in that brilliant golden sunset, she felt it clearly for the first time in years. She was truly standing on her own. 2 years passed since Evergreen Lodge was completed. Yet Avery still treasured every morning there, the soft light filtering through the pine branches, the scent of fresh wood mingling with roasted coffee, and the sound of the wind slipping through the narrow gaps in the wooden walls, like the steady breath of nature itself. Her life had become beautifully simple, almost meditative. She was no longer in Denver. No more crowded meetings, no more corporate deadlines, no more chasing validation through metrics and quarterly reviews. She lived in the forest, but she was not alone. Her design studio had grown into a small but respected brand in sustainable home design. She worked remotely, managing a team of architects and engineers online. Every week, new emails arrived from people who wanted to begin again just like you did, Avery. To her surprise, Evergreen Lodge had become a symbol. Young professionals came to visit, taking photos and posting with the hashtag #EvergreenStart. Some women wrote that seeing the cabin made them believe they too could rise again after being called failures. Avery never saw herself as someone to be admired. She was simply someone who had chosen not to stay down. But when she read their words, she saw fragments of herself. The girl who once sat in the dark, dismissed by her own family, yet still believed she deserved something more. Ryan and Avery were still together, living and working as two halves of the same project. He sometimes traveled for site work while she stayed at the cabin, tending to the garden, sketching new designs, and teaching online classes about small, sustainable homes. Their life wasn't loud, but it was full of meaning. It was a kind of peace Avery had never known in the first 32 years of her life. That morning, the May sky was crystal clear. Avery was kneeling by the porch wearing gardening gloves, planting lavender along the path. The breeze carried a faint trace of salt from the distant sea brushing against her skin. She was smiling to herself, thinking about what to cook for dinner, when she heard the sudden screech of tires at the gate. The sharp sound shattered the calm of the forest like glass breaking. Avery stood up, brushed the dirt from her hands, and stepped onto the porch. A silver BMW had stopped right in front of the small wooden sign that read, Evergreen Lodge Private Property. The car door opened, and the person who stepped out made her freeze. Leah, her sister. It was still the same face, delicate, polished to perfection, wearing a pristine white dress and a designer handbag slung over her shoulder. But something about her posture was completely different this time. Trembling, uncertain, her eyes wide with panic, like someone who had stumbled into a world she didn't belong to. Leah stepped out, holding her phone to her ear, her voice shaking. Dad, you need to come here now. Her voice cracked through the air, raw with fear, like a child crying for help. Avery stepped down from the porch, her heart pounding, but her voice calm. Leah, what's going on? Leah stopped looking at Avery, and for a moment her eyes filled with disbelief. You live here, she stammered. Oh my God, I can't believe this. Dad and Mom said you were bankrupt, that you ran off somewhere in the mountains. They said you lost everything. Her gaze swept around the cabin, the light wood walls, the big sunlit windows, the garden Avery had grown herself. Avery just stood there, still holding her gardening gloves, smiling faintly. What they think doesn't matter anymore, Leah. She paused. But why are you shaking? Leah went quiet, her lips trembling. A gust of wind swept through, tossing a few strands of her blonde hair across her face. Her voice softened. I just didn't expect you to be living like this. Avery raised an eyebrow. What do you mean by this? Leah looked down at her high heels, now smeared with mud, then back up, her eyes glistening with tears. You have everything, without anyone's help. And me, her voice broke. After the divorce, I'm still living in the house Mom and Dad bought. They still pay for everything. Every time I try to do something on my own, Mom says, don't be reckless like your sister. And I listen. Avery didn't say anything. Only the sound of the waves carried from far away and the slow, unfamiliar beat of her own heart. She didn't hate Leah. What she felt was a quiet ache for both of them. Two daughters raised under the same roof but taught opposite lessons. Avery had been taught to be strong until she turned to stone. And Leah had been taught that weakness was the only way to be loved. Leah stepped closer, running her fingers over the cabin wall. You built all of this yourself? She asked, her voice almost a whisper. Avery nodded. Every plank, every stone. With the help of friends, the people who believed in the sister our parents called a failure. Leah gave a small laugh, but it was thin and brittle. Mom and Dad won't believe it. They still tell everyone you're out there struggling somewhere that you're stubborn, that you don't listen. Avery smiled faintly. They need that story, Leah. It's easier than facing the truth that they were wrong. Leah went quiet, her head bowing. Sunlight filtered through the branches and fell across her shoulders, making her look more fragile than Avery had ever seen her. After a moment, she spoke, her voice so soft it nearly dissolved into the wind. I just realized you don't need them anymore. And I still do. The words fell like a small sharp cut that went deep. Avery looked at her sister. No arrogance now, no trace of the chosen child. In front of her stood a woman afraid of her own life. Avery wanted to hold her, but she knew if she did, Leah would break down. Instead, she placed her hand on the window ledge and stared out at the trees. You know, Leah, she said quietly, the day they called me a failure was the day I began to find myself. Maybe they had to be wrong so that we could finally have the chance to be right. Leah lifted her gaze, eyes brimming with tears. I'm jealous of you, she blurted out, as if afraid she might take it back. You have freedom, you have yourself. But me, her voice faltered. I'm just the version they wanted. I don't even know who I am anymore. Avery stepped closer, her voice gentle. Then stop living for them. Leah shook her head and gave a sad, trembling smile. Easier said than done. Avery nodded. She understood. She had been there before, knowing exactly which mountain she had to climb, yet too afraid to leave the ground. After a moment, Leah turned away and spoke quietly into her phone to their parents. Avery guessed, saying that everything was fine. When she hung up, Avery asked, What did you tell them? She replied, that you don't need saving, and maybe they should start looking at themselves. Before leaving, Leah stood at the gate for a long time looking at her sister. Are you happy? She asked. Avery smiled. For the first time in my life, I think I am. Leah nodded, her eyes red, then climbed into her car. The silver BMW turned on the narrow path, its tires crunching over gravel, the sound sharp drive fading into the distance. Avery stayed there watching until the sound of the engine blended with the crash of the sea. A gentle breeze swept through, carrying the scent of the lavender she had just planted. She closed her eyes and took a deep breath. Inside her, there was no anger left, only a strange, quiet peace. A peace she had bought with 2 years of silence and freedom. And somewhere far down the road, perhaps Leah was crying, not for Avery, but because for the first time she realized who had truly been left behind. About an hour after Leah left, as the sun began to tilt toward the forest, Avery heard the familiar sound of tires grinding over gravel, heavy, urgent, and full of tension. She didn't need to look to know it was her father's black SUV. The vehicle slid into the driveway, braking so abruptly that dust rose and settled in a pale film over the wooden sign, Evergreen Lodge Private Property. Avery stood on the porch, pruning shears still in hand, watching calmly as they stepped out. Eleanor was the first to open the door. Her face was pale lipstick-faded eyes filled with a tangle of emotions, anger, confusion, and something that almost looked like fear. Thomas followed his posture as rigid as ever, but his face tight veins visible along his neck. Leah stood between them, hands trembling slightly, eyes fixed on the ground, unsure which side to stand on. "Where did you get the money to do all this?" Thomas said, his voice clipped, skipping any greeting or pretense of civility. His words struck the air like a cold slap. He scanned the cabin, the trees, the small garden, and finally the solar panels on the roof. "Don't tell me you built all of this from your savings. This is a serious project. What are you hiding?" Avery stayed silent for a few seconds, then set the shears on the wooden table, wiped her hands with a cloth, and stepped toward him. Her voice was low but steady. "From the day you both called me a failure." She began meeting his gaze directly. Thomas frowned, confused. She continued. "Every time you said I wasn't good enough, I worked overtime. Every time you compared me to Leah, I learned a new skill. Every time you laughed at my dreams, I stayed up all night figuring out how to make them real. Every look of contempt, every word of doubt, that was the capital I used to build this place." Eleanor gripped her handbag tightly, her voice trembling. "Avery, we only wanted what's best for you. We never meant to hurt you." Avery let out a short, dry laugh that echoed in the still air. "What's best for me?" she asked, stepping closer. "Or what's best for your image? You don't want a child who dares to take a different path, who might fail, who is different. You want a perfect story to tell at parties, a child to show off, not to understand." Eleanor froze, tears slipping down her cheeks, but she made no rebuttal. Thomas turned away, pacing around the cabin, as if searching for a crack to prove Avery was lying. He examined the walls, the roof, the window frames. With each step he took, Avery's chest grew heavier. She could tell he was torn between believing and not believing, between the image of the failure daughter he had built in his mind, and the woman standing before him, now steady and unafraid. Ryan stepped out of the house, then calm but decisive. He merely nodded in greeting and stood quietly beside Avery. Thomas's eyes flicked toward him, a flash of confusion crossing his face. Perhaps he had heard the rumor that Avery was living alone in the woods, that no one cared. Now the man before him saw that she was neither lonely nor pitiable. The only one left behind was him, stranded in the dust of old prejudices. "Did you do all this to get revenge?" Thomas asked, his voice low and choked. Avery shook her head. "No, Dad. If I wanted revenge, I would have sent a bill. But I don't need to do that. Every morning you wake up in the house you thought was stable, and I wake up in the place I built with my own hands. This is my victory." The air went still. Only the distant sound of the sea remained, crashing in steady waves like a heartbeat. Thomas turned back to her. His eyes no longer sharp, no longer full of contempt, but something else entirely heavy, conflicted, fragile. He opened his mouth, but it took several seconds before he could speak. "We were wrong." Those 4 words fell like a bell toll. Eleanor broke into tears, covering her face with both hands. Thomas stood motionless, fingers interlaced, staring at the ground. Then slowly he asked, "Can you forgive us?" His voice was small, tired, like a man who had just laid down a burden he'd carried for years. Avery stayed silent. Ryan gently squeezed her hand, as if to remind her she didn't have to say anything. But she still lifted her gaze, looking out toward the forest, where the last of the evening light scattered through the trees. "I don't need to forgive to be free," she said softly. "I already found it." They both stood there silent. Eleanor sniffled, turning away to wipe her tears with her sleeve. Thomas exhaled, no longer hiding his age or his weariness. Avery didn't say anything more. Everything had been spoken. Nothing needed to be repeated. They left as dusk settled in. Avery watched the SUV disappear down the gravel road, her heart free of hatred. All that remained was a strange feeling, as though she had just closed a long chapter of her life. Ryan stepped beside her, draped a coat over her shoulders. "You okay?" he asked. Avery nodded, her eyes still following the line of the forest road. "I'm okay. For the first time in my life. Truly okay." A week after that encounter, when the early winter sun slanted through the forest, and a thin layer of frost still clung to the cabin windows, Avery received a thick cream-colored envelope in the mail. There was no return address, only the words, "To Avery," written in a familiar hand, neat measured as if composed with the shame of someone trying to preserve their dignity. She knew instantly it was from her father. Avery sat for a long while before opening it, her hands trembling slightly. Inside were 2 sheets of paper, a long letter, and a photograph of their old house in Boston, with a "For Sale" sign out front. At the bottom of the photo was a short line, "We sold the house. Maybe it's time to start over." She unfolded the letter. Thomas's handwriting was shakier now, no longer sharp and confident. He wrote that he and Eleanor had talked for many nights, realizing that all these years they had loved her in the worst possible way. Loving with conditions, loving through expectations, loving by comparison. He said Eleanor had cried often ashamed for not protecting Avery from her own favoritism. They had decided to leave behind the house that had become too big, too quiet, where every wall carried both Leah's shadow and Avery's absence. "If you don't want to see us again, we understand," he wrote. "But know this, for the first time in our lives, we are truly proud of you." Avery folded the letter and placed it on the wooden table. No tears, no smile. A part of her had longed to hear those words for decades, but when they finally came, all she felt was an unfamiliar calm. She didn't write back. She didn't call. She didn't even keep the photo. Instead, she stepped outside where the cold wind swept through the forest and the air smelled of pine and damp soil. In a corner of the yard, she dug a small hole and placed inside a young pine tree she'd brought back from town. As she covered it with earth, she whispered, "For a new beginning for myself." Ryan stood a few steps away, hands in his pockets, watching her with a quiet, warm smile. When she finished patting down the last bit of soil, he walked toward her, holding a small walnut box carved with delicate handmade patterns. "I made this from the first tree we cut to build the cabin," he said, his voice low and steady. Avery opened the box. Inside was a simple ring, a slender loop of polished wood coated with a soft wax sheen. No diamond, no gold, just warmth and truth. "Avery Collins," he said, kneeling in the damp earth. "Will you keep building with me? Not just cabins, but the rest of our lives?" She laughed through tears. In the middle of the forest, surrounded by the scent of pine and the hum of the wind, she nodded. "Yes, but this time we draw the blueprint together." He smiled and pulled her close. Above them, sunlight filtered through the treetops, scattering in golden streaks like quiet blessings. That evening, as the sun sank behind the forest, Avery sat on the cabin steps, watching the firelight flicker on the glass window. Ryan was inside cooking dinner, and she opened her notebook, the one she'd used to write down every step of her journey. She wrote, "They once gave my sister $150,000. They gave me silence. But that silence became the greatest gift because in it I found my voice. I don't need to be acknowledged. I just need to be myself, and that's enough." The wind drifted through the forest, stirring the pages of her notebook. She closed her eyes, listening to the sound of waves in the distance, blending with the whisper of the trees, a gentle symphony of healing. In that moment, she understood that everything had come full circle. No more apologies were needed. No more proof was required. It was enough to know that the child once called a failure had built a life of freedom with her own hands and her own faith. Spring arrived, bringing with it soft rains and wildflowers that carpeted the forest floor. The young pine tree Avery had planted began to sprout new growth, its bright green needles catching the morning light. Life at Evergreen Lodge settled into a rhythm marked by the natural cycles of the earth, rather than the artificial pressures of deadlines and expectations. Avery's design studio continued to grow, not in the traditional sense of expansion and profit, but in depth and purpose. She limited her projects to those that aligned with her values, working primarily with families and organizations committed to sustainable living. Ryan partnered with local builders, teaching them the techniques they had developed while constructing Evergreen, creating a small but significant shift in how homes were built in the coastal communities. Together, they began hosting weekend workshops at the cabin, teaching others the principles of sustainable design and construction. People came from across the country, sleeping in tents around the property, eager to learn how to build their own versions of freedom. What you've created here isn't just a home, one participant told Avery as they sat around the fire on the final evening of a workshop. It's proof that we can choose a different way to live. Avery smiled, watching the flames dance in the darkness. That's exactly what it was always meant to be. During these gatherings, she never mentioned her family story. She didn't need to use her pain as currency for connection. The cabin spoke for itself, a testament to resilience, to choosing creation over bitterness, to building something new from the rubble of rejection. But the past was never fully closed. One evening, as summer approached, Ryan returned from town with an envelope addressed to Avery. Inside was an invitation to Leah's wedding, a simple card with elegant typography announcing her marriage to Michael Davis, a local musician from Seacliff. "Are you going to go?" Ryan asked, watching her reaction carefully. Avery ran her fingers over the embossed lettering. "I'm surprised she's inviting me." "Maybe she needs you there." Avery thought about their last encounter, about the jealousy and revelation in Leah's eyes. "Maybe I need to be there too." The wedding was small, held on the public beach in Seacliff with just 30 guests. No extravagance, no performance of wealth, just a simple ceremony with the ocean as witness. Avery and Ryan stood at the back watching, as Leah, radiant in a simple white dress, walked toward a young man with kind eyes and a guitar calloused hands. Thomas and Eleanor sat in the front row, both noticeably thinner than when Avery had last seen them, aged by the recognition of their mistakes. They didn't notice her arrival until after the ceremony, when guests gathered for the reception in a small beachfront restaurant. Eleanor saw her first freezing mid-conversation, her champagne glass hovering in the air. She nudged Thomas, whose eyes widened as he turned. They stood for a moment, separated by the width of the room and the weight of years, before Eleanor handed her glass to her husband and walked slowly toward her eldest daughter. "Avery," she said, her voice barely audible above the music. "You came. Leah invited me." Eleanor nodded, tears gathering in her eyes. "She said she was going to, but we didn't think—" She trailed off, unable to finish the thought. "I almost didn't," Avery admitted. "But some circles need to be closed." Eleanor reached out hesitantly, her hand stopping just short of touching Avery's arm. "We got your silence. We read it many times." "I didn't send a silence," Avery corrected gently. "I made a choice." "We understand that now," Thomas said, joining them, his voice softer than Avery had ever heard it. "We're trying to make different choices too." Avery looked at her father, noticing the new lines around his eyes, the slight stoop to his shoulders. Age had humbled him in ways she could never have accomplished through confrontation. "I heard you sold the house," she said. He nodded. "Too many ghosts. We're in a condo downtown now, smaller, quieter." "Are you happy?" she asked, echoing the question Leah had asked her months before. Thomas and Eleanor exchanged glances. "We're learning," her mother said. "It's not easy starting over at our age." Avery felt a surge of something unfamiliar, sympathy perhaps for these aging parents who had finally recognized the cost of their perfectionism. "It's never easy at any age," she said, "but it's always possible." They talked for a few more minutes, the conversation careful but not cold. There was no dramatic reconciliation, no tearful embrace that would erase the decades of hurt. Just small steps toward a new kind of relationship, one built on reality, rather than expectation. As they parted, Thomas said, "Your cabin. It's remarkable, Avery. You've created something truly special." "Thank you," she replied, accepting the compliment as what it was, an acknowledgement finally of her worth on her own terms. Later, as Leah and Michael shared their first dance, Avery stood with Ryan on the restaurant's deck, watching the waves break against the shore. "Are you okay?" he asked, his arm around her waist. She nodded. "Better than I expected. They seem, smaller somehow. Pain tends to magnify people in our minds. When we heal, they return to their actual size." She rested her head against his shoulder. "When did you get so wise?" He smiled. "I've always been wise. You were just too busy hammering things to notice." They laughed, the sound carrying on the sea breeze. Below them, the party continued, but they remained apart from it, content in their shared solitude. Leah found them there as the reception was winding down. She had kicked off her shoes, her hair coming loose from its careful arrangement. "You came?" she said, breathless from dancing. "I wouldn't miss my little sister's wedding," Avery replied. Leah's smile was genuine, lighting up her face in a way Avery hadn't seen since they were children. "Michael is a music teacher at the elementary school here. We're going to live in a little apartment above the bookstore downtown. Can you believe it? Me in a walk-up apartment." "I'm proud of you," Avery said, meaning it completely. "It's because of you," Leah said, lowering her voice. "Seeing your cabin, your life. It made me realize I had choices too." Avery shook her head. "You always had choices, Leah. You just needed to believe you deserved them." Leah hugged her, then the first real embrace they had shared in years. "Thank you for coming back," she whispered. "Even after everything." "Some bonds can't be broken," Avery replied, "even when stretched thin." As they pulled apart, Leah looked at Ryan, then back at her sister. "Will there be another wedding soon?" Avery smiled. "Not the kind with white dresses and champagne, but yes, in our own way." Leah beamed. "Good. You deserve every happiness." She was called back to the party, then leaving Avery and Ryan alone again, with the sound of the ocean and the scent of salt air. "Your sister has changed," he observed. "We all have." The drive back to Evergreen Lodge that night was quiet, each of them lost in thought. The forest welcomed them home with its familiar darkness, punctuated by patches of moonlight through the trees. As they approached the cabin, came into view windows glowing with the light they had left on a beacon in the wilderness. "Home," Ryan said simply. Avery nodded. "Home." Summer faded into fall, and fall gave way to winter. The second anniversary of Evergreen Lodge's completion passed quietly, marked only by a small dinner with friends from Seacliff and a few of the artisans who had helped with the final touches on the cabin. Jack Morgan drove up from Denver bringing a cake decorated with a miniature cabin made from marzipan. "To the house that changed everything," he toasted, raising his glass. "To the people who made it possible," Avery amended, looking around at the faces of those who had believed in her vision, when it was nothing more than sketches and dreams. The evening was filled with laughter and stories, the cabin warm with friendship and shared purpose. As their guests departed, promising to return for the spring workshop series, Avery stood on the porch watching their headlights wind through the trees. Ryan joined her, draping a blanket over her shoulders against the chill. "Happy?" he asked. "Content," she replied. "It's deeper than happiness." He nodded, understanding perfectly. Late that night, as snow began to fall, covering the world in pristine white, Avery sat at her desk, finishing the final edits on a book she had been writing for the past year. Building from Ruin, A Guide to Sustainable Living and Personal Renewal, was part memoir, part practical manual for those seeking to create their own version of Evergreen Lodge. She hadn't planned to write it, but after so many requests for guidance, it seemed the natural next step in sharing what she had learned. The manuscript had already been accepted by a small publishing house, specializing in environmental texts with a release plan for the spring. As she typed the final words of the acknowledgments, thanking Ryan and their community of supporters, she paused, cursor blinking on the screen. After a moment's hesitation, she added one more paragraph. "And to my family, Thomas, Eleanor, and Leah. Our story wasn't perfect, but it was ours. In seeking your approval, I found my strength. In your rejection, I found my path. For that complicated gift, I am grateful." She sat back, reading the words again. It wasn't forgiveness exactly. It was something more nuanced, an acknowledgement that even painful relationships can yield unexpected growth, that rejection can sometimes be the push needed to find one's true direction. The next morning, she mailed the completed manuscript. As she walked back from the small post office in Seacliff, her phone rang, an unusual occurrence in the coastal town, where service was spotty at best. The number was unfamiliar. "Is this Avery Collins?" a woman's voice asked when she answered. "Yes, it is. This is Margaret Chen from Habitat for Humanity. We've been following your work with sustainable microhousing, and we're wondering if you might be interested in consulting on a project we're developing." Avery listened as Margaret explained their vision, a community of small, sustainable homes for families transitioning out of homelessness. They needed someone who understood both the practical and psychological aspects of creating spaces that fostered healing and independence. "We can't offer much in terms of payment," Margaret concluded, "but we thought your philosophy aligned with our mission." "It does," Avery said without hesitation. "I'd be honored to help." When she told Ryan about the call that evening, his eyes lit up. "This is it, isn't it? The bigger purpose we talked about." She nodded, excitement building as she sketched preliminary ideas. "Imagine a whole community built on these principles. Not just environmental sustainability, but emotional sustainability. Spaces that help people rebuild their lives. From ruin to renewal," he said, echoing the subtitle of her book. "Exactly." They worked late into the night, expanding the vision, talking through challenges, imagining possibilities. This was what Evergreen Lodge had always been meant to become, not just a private sanctuary, but a template for a different way of living. 3 months later, Avery stood on a vacant lot in Portland, Oregon, watching as volunteers raised the walls of the first home in what would become Evergreen Community, 12 microhomes surrounding a shared garden and community center. Each house incorporated the lessons learned from building the original cabin, adapted for urban settings and diverse family needs. Ryan coordinated the construction team, moving between building sites with the calm authority that had first drawn her to him. Local builders inspired by the project had donated materials and time. Architecture students from nearby universities came to learn their enthusiasm, bringing fresh energy to the work. As Avery walked through the site, checking plans and answering questions, she noticed a familiar silver car parked at the edge of the lot. Leah stepped out, looking different than she had at the wedding, her designer clothes replaced by jeans and a flannel shirt, her hair pulled back in a simple ponytail. "Surprise," she called, walking toward her sister. Avery hugged her, genuinely pleased. "What are you doing here?" "I took a week off to volunteer," Leah explained. "Michael's holding down the fort at home." "You building houses?" Avery couldn't hide her surprise. Leah laughed. "I know, right? But I've been following your project online, and I wanted to be part of it. Plus, I've never actually built anything with my hands before. Thought it was time to learn." Avery looked at her sister, seeing beyond the polished exterior she had maintained for so long. To the person emerging underneath someone curious, brave in her own way, seeking to define herself beyond the role she had been assigned. "We can always use another pair of hands," Avery said. "Even soft ones." Leah grimaced, holding up her manicured fingers. "Not for long, I'm guessing." "Trust me, calluses are badges of honor around here." They worked side by side that day, Avery teaching Leah the basics of measuring and cutting, how to hold a hammer, how to read the simple plans. Leah was a quick study, her natural intelligence finding new application in physical work. By afternoon, she was helping install window frames, her face flushed with exertion and pride. During a water break sitting on stacked lumber, Leah asked, "Do you ever think about how differently we were raised? You to doubt yourself, me to doubt nothing." Avery considered the question. "I think they did the best they could with the fears they had. They were afraid for you after the miscarriages, afraid for me because I was different. Fear makes people create strange systems." "They call me every day now," Leah said, "checking in, making sure I'm okay. It's like they're afraid I'll disappear too." "You won't," Avery assured her. "You're finding your own way." Leah looked around at the half-built homes. "Is it strange that this feels more like home than our house in Boston ever did?" "Not strange at all. Home isn't about perfect furniture or matching dishes. It's about feeling safe enough to be yourself." That evening, they invited Leah to stay at Evergreen Lodge rather than the hotel she had booked in town. They ate dinner on the porch, watching the sunset turn the sky into a canvas of pink and gold. Ryan told stories about his time in the Marines, making them laugh with tales of desert mishaps and barracks pranks. Leah shared updates about her life with Michael, their plans to open a small music school, their dreams of eventually having children. As night fell and the forest filled with the sound of crickets, Avery felt a deep sense of rightness, of pieces falling into place. The family she had been born into was finding its way toward healing, however imperfect. The family she had chosen was strong and supportive. The purpose she had discovered was expanding beyond her personal journey to touch other lives. Later, after Ryan had gone to bed, Avery and Leah sat by the dying fire, sharing the last of a bottle of wine. "Can I ask you something?" Leah said, her voice quiet in the darkness. "Anything. Do you think it's too late for me to find what you found?" Avery looked at her sister, seeing the vulnerability beneath the question. "It's never too late to become who you might have been." "George Eliot," Leah said, smiling. "You recognize the quote, 'I read, you know.' Not just fashion magazines." They laughed softly, the sound mingling with the crackling embers. "I want you to know something," Avery said after a moment. "I never hated you. I hated the system that pitted us against each other, but never you." Leah's eyes glistened in the firelight. "I think I always knew that. It made it harder somehow. If you had hated me, I could have hated you back. But you just withdrew, became this mystery I could never solve. I'm not so mysterious, just determined, and talented, and brave." Leah reached across the space between them, taking her sister's hand. "I'm sorry I didn't see it sooner." "We see things when we're ready to see them," Avery replied, squeezing her hand. "Not before." The week passed quickly, filled with work at the building site. Leah proved to be a natural organizer, coordinating volunteers and managing supply deliveries with an efficiency that impressed everyone. By the time she needed to return home, she had become an integral part of the project, promising to return for the community's opening ceremony in 2 months. As they said goodbye, Leah hugged her sister tightly. "Thank you for letting me be part of this. You're always part of my life, Leah, even when we're apart. I'll tell Mom and Dad about the project. They want to help, in whatever way you'll let them." Avery nodded, not committing, but not refusing either. One step at a time, she watched Leah's car disappear down the forest road, feeling not the sharp pain of separation, but the gentle ache of distance that would always exist between them. A gap narrowed, but never completely closed by their different paths. The Evergreen community was completed in early spring, right as Avery's book was released. The timing seemed perfect, bringing attention to both projects and amplifying their impact. The opening ceremony was attended by local officials, media, and most importantly, the families who would be moving into the new homes. Avery stood back, letting others take the spotlight. The project coordinators from Habitat for Humanity, the local volunteers who had contributed countless hours, the future residents themselves, each with a story of resilience that mirrored her own in different ways. She felt a tap on her shoulder and turned to find Thomas and Eleanor standing there, looking uncertain but determined. Her father held a copy of her book in his hands, the pages already dog-eared and marked with notes. "We hope it's okay that we came," Eleanor said. "Leah told us about it." "It's okay," Avery said, surprised to find she meant it. Thomas held out the book. "Would you sign it for us?" "We've read it twice already." Avery took the book, noting the careful annotations in her father's precise handwriting. She opened to the title page and wrote simply, "To New Beginnings, Avery." As she handed it back, Thomas said quietly, "We're so proud of who you've become. Not because of what you've accomplished, but because of how you've accomplished it with integrity and purpose." The words she had once longed to hear now washed over her like gentle rain welcome, but no longer essential to her sense of self. "Thank you," she said, meaning it. They stood together watching as families toured their new homes, children running excitedly from room to room, parents wiping away tears of gratitude and relief. The houses were small, but thoughtfully designed, each detail considered for both practicality and emotional impact. They were places to heal, to grow, to begin again. Ryan joined them, introducing himself properly to Avery's parents. To her surprise, he and Thomas soon fell into a detailed conversation about sustainable building materials, her father's financial background finding common ground with Ryan's practical knowledge. Eleanor touched Avery's arm hesitantly. "He's wonderful." "He is," Avery agreed. "But more importantly, he sees me, really sees me." Her mother's eyes filled with tears. "I'm sorry I didn't." "We can't change the past, Mom, but we can build something different now." After the ceremony, as they prepared to return to Evergreen Lodge, Thomas asked, "Would you and Ryan consider coming to Boston sometime just for a visit? We'd like to show you our new place." Avery looked at Ryan, who nodded slightly, leaving the decision to her. "Maybe in the fall," she said, "after the workshop season ends." It wasn't a promise exactly, but it was an opening a small window through which something new might grow. Back at the cabin, as twilight settled over the forest, Avery and Ryan sat on the porch swing they had built together the previous summer. The air was cool but pleasant, filled with the scent of pine and new growth. In the garden, the lavender Avery had planted was beginning to bloom its purple flowers, catching the last light. "What are you thinking?" Ryan asked, his arm warm around her shoulders. "About circles," she replied. "How sometimes they close, and sometimes they spiral into something new." He smiled understanding, as he always did. "And which is happening now?" She considered the question, watching as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. "Both, I think. One story ending, another beginning." Ryan reached into his pocket and pulled out a small envelope. "This came for you today. I forgot with all the excitement." Avery opened it to find a note from one of the new Evergreen community residents, a single mother of two who had been homeless for nearly a year after escaping an abusive relationship. The note was simple. "In my darkest moments, I never imagined a place like this could be mine. You've given my children more than shelter. You've given them proof that broken things can be rebuilt stronger than before. Thank you for showing us the way home." Tears filled Avery's eyes as she passed the note to Ryan. This was the true measure of what they had created, not in square footage or sustainability metrics, but in lives transformed. The rejection that had once threatened to destroy her had instead become the foundation for something beautiful, something that reached beyond her personal healing to touch others, walking similar paths. "We build our temples for tomorrow strong as we know how," Ryan quoted softly. Langston Hughes. Avery identified the quote, smiling through her tears. "I read, not just building manuals." They laughed, the sound carrying into the forest like an offering. Later that night, as moonlight streamed through the windows of Evergreen Lodge, Avery stood looking out at the silvered landscape. Behind her, the cabin glowed with soft light, every corner filled with memories of struggle and triumph, of breaking and rebuilding. She thought about the long journey from that dinner table in Boston to this moment, the pain that had driven her forward, the determination that had sustained her, the love that had healed her. She thought about her parents trying in their imperfect way to make amends, about Leah finding her own voice at last, about Ryan, who had seen her strength when she could only feel her wounds. Most of all, she thought about the words her father had once used to dismiss her. "You're the failure, Avery. We invest in winners." How wrong he had been, and how right. For in failing to meet their expectations, she had found her true direction. In losing their investment, she had gained something far more valuable, the knowledge that she was enough exactly as she was. Outside, the young pine tree she had planted swayed gently in the night breeze, its branches reaching toward the stars. Beside it, smaller seedlings were beginning to grow, the next generation, the continuation of a story that had only just begun. Avery turned from the window and went back to bed, curling against Ryan's warmth. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new projects, new opportunities to transform pain into purpose. The cabin would continue to evolve, as would the lives within it. Nothing was finished. Everything was becoming. And in that becoming lay the greatest victory of all, the freedom to grow, not from others' expectations, but from the rich soil of one's own heart, to build not monuments to approval, but shelters for authentic living, to create not what the world demanded, but what the soul required. As she drifted toward sleep, Avery felt a profound sense of peace. The wounds that had once defined her had become merely chapters in a longer story, one still being written word by word, day by day, choice by choice. A story built from ruin, yes, but blossoming now with boundless possibility. A home for her true self at last.